It's got a little bit of a gain here that I can turn up if I need to. I can't hear myself very well, but how about now? You can hear me good? Okay. All right. All right, well, thanks everyone for being here this morning. Welcome to the Baled session. This is a subject that has been one that is still something that is very, still quite new. I think a lot of folks are using this technology to great effect. We still get a lot of questions about that. I know I get a lot of questions about that in Georgia and the Southeast. And this is a session that we thought would be a good idea to cover some of the basics and then work up to some of the science that underpins a lot of the recommendations. I'm going to start out with a talk, and unfortunately it's quite similar to the talk that was given yesterday morning, but I think maybe repetition is good sometimes. There are a few things that I've added and there's a few things that I've taken out rather than repeating some of that, but I want to focus on some of the keys from my perspective of what are the keys to making great baleage. So I'll start out with more of the practical aspects, and then we'll have a couple of scientists doing some work in that field who will fill in some of the details there for us. So, this is not just making wet hay, right? There's a difference here from what we're seeing here depicted. And I think, unfortunately, this is, for some folks, this is the idea that they have in mind for what baleage is. And it's definitely different than that. Let me start out with defining this because it really is silage. And the brief overview here of silage is it's a forage preservation technique that utilizes the fermentation of sugars into acid. And that acid is what prevents the spoilage that occurs. So you're taking plant sugars and primarily converting it over to lactic acid, some acetic acid, some other organic acids as well. The key there is it has to be in anaerobic conditions. And this is what prevents the mold growth, the yeast growth, and some rather nasty bacterial growth as well. The low pH here, the way that works actually reduces the enzymatic activity of some of the undesirable bacteria. And that's what really makes this work, is the low pH. Now this is not a new process, and siling has been going on since the 1500 BC era, according to some historical work and anthropological work that's been done over the years. Baled silage is a variation of this, and something that has, it's much more efficient than just making hay for a variety of perspectives. Because if you look at the losses that are along each step of the way here, in the field, in the wilting process, there's much less respiration loss, in the field at least, 2 to 5% loss. Baling loss, because you're keeping a lot more moisture in the crop, you're not shattering as many leaves, you're getting a lot more of that into the baler, so less than 5% loss there. Storage loss, this is one that can be kind of all over the board. This is a survey of the literature, but honestly, I think typically what you'd find is about 10% loss, 10 to 15% loss for baleage, and then minimal feeding loss. Really, these animals will literally lick the ground where this stuff has been. They really do eat it well. And of course, if you're managing it correctly, and the end result can be, maybe as much as 85, 90% of what was originally in the field. Now here's the goal, right, is to avoid weather damage. And that's one of the reasons why it became so popular in Europe decades ago, and now it's becoming a lot more popular for us here in the U.S. It really enables a timely harvest, lowers the risk of rain damage. It's not out there for exposed to the elements. At least in the southeast, it might be out there for 4 or 5 days before it dries down enough for us to be able to store it properly as hay. Whereas for baleage, in many cases you can cut and bale maybe even the same day, but at least overnight, wilting it, and you're at the target moisture. A lot less leaf shatter, and as a result of that, you have a better quality product. Lower fiber components, higher crude protein, increased digestibility, and increased palatability. So the key, though, is that there's nothing magical about wrapping this in white plastic. You put garbage into it, you're going to get garbage back out of it. Okay? When I first started working with this, this is actually some of my master's research at the University of Kentucky. We were doing some field demonstrations and extension work with it, and we had a lot of producers that are taking just junk tall fescue and wrapping it and turning it into something that was a little bit more palatable. Yeah, they would eat it better, but sometimes you can starve to death with a full belly too. So, there's nothing magical about wrapping it in plastic. One thing I do want to share with you, though, is the increases in quality of this product. And I share with you just this slide set, or slide here from some work that I did at the University of Georgia, up in this northwest corner of Georgia in Calhoun. We had, and I want to primarily point out the two lines here at the bottom, ryegrass baleage and ryegrass hay. That field was cut the exact same day, the exact same conditions. We just took random windrows or random swaths and assigned them to baleage or to dry out for hay. This was actually grazed over once ryegrass, so it's not the rocket fuel ryegrass that you might see some really high quality stuff, but it's still, I mean, an RFQ of 174 is just outstanding. But you can see the differences that occurred. The same field, same conditions, just a difference in drying time and exposure. You can see the differences in the nutritional value that also translated into animal performance. We fed these to replacement beef heifers without any additional supplementation, and you can see the performance that we were getting there, almost to the point of getting them to roly-poly fat if we would continue on that route. The goal there for replacement heifers would be about 1.75 pounds per head per day. So let's get into the details of what are some of those keys. And I think the very first key is, and probably one of the biggest mistakes is, that producers need to cut down no more than what they can handle in a given period of time. The bottleneck in this operation is the wrapping process, almost usually. And sometimes it's going to be the transportation in and out of the field or what have you. But usually this is the process that's the bottleneck. Every bale needs to be wrapped at least within 12 hours of baling, and I would highly recommend within 4 hours. Highly, highly recommend within 4 hours. 12 hours, you get some significant heating going on there and some significant changes in that, particularly when you're dealing with high sugar material. The amount that you cut has to equal the amount that you can bale and wrap in the same day. Okay? That's where things sometimes go off the rails, is they will cut down more than what they can handle. If you're cutting a field that you normally cut for hay and you cut it the same way, expecting that you will be able to handle that big acreage, and if you've got an individual bale wrapper, that your bottleneck is really going to slow you down to be able to get all of that done in the same day. So you want to lay down an appropriate amount of forage for wilting, baling, and wrapping. And typically, and this is going to vary from site within the U.S., but for our producers in Georgia, usually we can cut mid-afternoon on one day and bale and wrap the next day. Sometimes in the winter months when we're cutting ryegrass, for example, it's going to take a day or two for it to wilt down to the right moisture. But as a general rule for us, that's going to vary by location, of course. The second key then, of course, is to address your bottleneck, which is the bale wrapper. So choosing the right bale wrapper is really, really important. So when you're evaluating those, not only looking at cost, but look at the labor, the speed, and the throughput that you can have for those bale wrappers. So make sure that you know what you're getting. The speed at which you can wrap bales with this kind of system versus an inline system is dramatically different, and the labor requirement there is dramatically different as well. So let's talk about the two basic types of bale wrapping systems. This is the inline bale wrapper, which is a platform on which the bales are placed, and then two rolls are winding their way around the outside of those bales, wrapping in a stretch wrap plastic. We'll talk more about what the plastic does in just a little bit here. And as soon as that gets through, the plunger will retract and you can load another bale. Generally speaking, you'll be able to wrap bales as quick as you can unload a trailer. It's fairly efficient, time efficient, and so forth. This one may be even just a little slower than what some of the modern ones are. This is about an 8-year-old video now. The individual bale wrappers are quite a bit slower, but they create an individual bale package, as you can see here in the background. The key here, though, is to make sure you size it correctly. You know, the dimensions of this bale wrapper have to match the dimensions of your bale. And the other key there is to make sure that you make good uniform bales. And if they begin to squat and get deformed, you have a real problem getting uniform plastic around the outside of those bales. So just a brief overview of those different wrapper styles. The three-point hitch styles usually are going to be some sort of individual, although this one's kind of more like an inline. That's an older style, and I'm not even sure if that's still on the market or not. But these are the two primary ones, and this just is a rough ballpark of what a new one would cost you, particularly if you're buying on the state contract. Hang on, we always have to pay more than what an average producer would have to pay. But you can find you know, a used one out there for pretty decent price if you're just trying to get into the market as well. So let's look at some of the other baleage costs, and obviously the next one would be plastic cost. And this is going to vary a little bit, and honestly I haven't updated these in a while. With the oil prices going down, we might have seen a little bit of relief on plastic cost, but around $6 to $8 per ton of dry matter. Your wrapper cost is going to be about $2 to $5 per ton of dry matter. Your fuel and repairs are going to vary quite a bit depending on what style of wrapper that you have, anywhere from 50 cents to $5 per ton of dry matter. And then your labor costs are going to add up as well. And again, this could be $2 plus per ton of dry matter. So all of a sudden now we're starting to think, yeah, I mean, we got a little bit of a problem here money-wise, all right? Yes, it is more expensive, but what are you getting out of this? And many of our producers are still putting that hay out on the ground with no cover whatsoever. And I think one of the other speakers said here in Missouri, they expect a loss of about 50%. And that's pretty much the case in Georgia as well. It's a huge amount of loss with that hay outside on the ground. And so when I'm looking at producers and trying to look at options here, you know, if that hay is valued at $120 a ton, that's really costing them $60 per ton. And as my good friend Dr. Don Ball is fond of saying, you're paying for a barn whether you want to or not, right? Now, if we are looking at baleage by comparison, though, you know, at $120 a ton, that's about $18 of losses, okay, physical losses. So what you're working with is the difference here. $42 worth of slush there that you could afford to invest to make up that difference. But that alone is not necessarily going to make up the whole difference, okay? I think it's important to realize the increased quality is going to be a great value to you. We actually looked at some economics behind this. Kurt Lacey, our Extension Ag economist at the University of Georgia, and I and Ross Pruitt from LSU put together a model to try to look at this, and based on some of the assumptions of storage losses and comparisons there, but also the value of the extra quality. Now, if we take Bermuda grass baleage, and I realize this is a very busy slide, but this little dotted line here that says $0, anything lower than that, if you see any of those lines lower than zero, that means your probability of breaking even is pretty low. Your probability of breaking even here with winter annual baleage is quite high, okay? And the point here is that in higher quality baleage, higher quality forage, baleage makes a whole lot more sense than in something low quality. You know, something low quality like that old rank tall fescue that I was talking about earlier, or Bermuda grass baleage. And that's assuming, of course, there's enough sugar in that Bermuda grass to actually get it to ferment very well. And that can sometimes be a challenge itself. So just a kind of a brief overview, because I don't have enough time to go into all of the economics that we did there, but the baleage technology does have economic merit for beef cow-calf producers. The break-even herd size that we calculated was approximately 50 cows if the producer already had the hay equipment. If the producer does not already have the hay equipment, it was about 150 to 200 cows. Okay, now that's also saying something about the importance of valuing your hay equipment in your beef cattle operation too. It really is a combined reduction in forage and feeding and storage losses that help make this economically feasible, but in and of itself, that's not enough. You have to look at the value of the extra quality that you're going to get out of these winter annuals, good high quality cool season grasses, alfalfa, and mixed grasses, mixed grass legume stands as well. It's very, very difficult to justify baleage only if you're dealing with these low quality forages. The third thing I think you want to do is to explore your options. Many of our producers who are getting into this are not necessarily doing it just for themselves, but they're also trying to do a little bit of custom hire work on the side. Okay? Now some of them have just completely switched over, and that's pretty much all they do, but most of our producers who have this, they'll do a few for their neighbors, or they may even have a pretty significant part of their business is to go out and do some of this custom work on the side. In fact, I traveled to New Zealand a few years back, and you know what's striking there is that most of those beef cattle producers do not own their own hay equipment. They contract all of that done, and a much more efficient system there. Baling at the right range of moisture. I think Dr. Koblentz and perhaps Kunjun will do this as well, but baling at the right moisture is really, really critical. If we get it too dry, we end up with a risk of poor fermentation. If we get it too high moisture, we end up with a very high risk of toxic compounds being created, particularly the clostridial type of action, spoilage that would be going on there, and even causing botulism. So that's a very, very big risk, and cattle have died as a result of feeding them spoiled silage like that. The ideal range is a little bit of a broad one. I purposefully leave this a little bit broad. I think right around 60% moisture, if you can target that, that's going to be pretty good. Some producers like to err on the side of a little bit drier so that it is a little easier to handle perhaps. Usually if you start out about 65% moisture in our environment, by the time you finish in that field, you're down to 50%. So usually if I can get them in that range, that's going to be ideal. Now, how do you determine moisture? Well, of course, there are some options with regard to hay moisture testers, the probes. To be honest with you, I haven't had a great deal of success with those. They will get you in the ballpark, but they certainly are not gospel. All right, they are not perfect with regard to their assessment of that. Honestly, I think that most of our producers are probably better by feel. Once they get calibrated to it, they're probably better by feel than I know that I certainly feel like I'm more calibrated to it than perhaps what that moisture tester is. The second most best method would be the microwave moist tester. There is a description on how to do this straight out of the Southern Forage's book, Don. This is a real great description of that, and I put it up on the website here with just a little quick link here if you'd like to access it. The microwave moisture test is a good option for doing this. Can be pretty cheap too. You could pick up a cheap microwave at a yard sale or something like that for 20 or 30 bucks and a food scale for 20 or 30 bucks, and you can be in business. And that is going to take you quite a bit of time there to dry it down, and you're probably going to have to bring it back to the house or to the barn to do it. But do not use your wife's microwave. Ask me how I know, right? Ask me how I know. All right, the best way is, in my opinion, is to use the coaster moisture tester. That is the best way to determine moisture, and fairly quick and efficient way of doing it. The next key there is to make sure you're making good bales. Now, first of all, you want to maximize the bale size. Okay, you want to make sure that you're maximizing the package, but you also want to match it to the tractor. You got to realize that these bales are going to be significantly heavier than hay bales if you're just getting into the baleage operation here. It's also critically important to make dense bales, and I think our speakers afterwards will be addressing a little bit of that about bale density to get all that oxygen out that you possibly can. The 4-foot wide and 5-foot tall bale is the most popular, and the range of weights on that is going to vary quite a bit depending not only on moisture but also on the density of the baler. But the key there when you're making those bales is to make sure you have nice square edges to the tops of those bales, so that when those bales match up, especially in an inline wrapper, that they match up and you don't have one that's offset off of the other, stretching that plastic and leaving some air in there, some gaps in there for mold to occur. Certainly you want to use plastic twine or net wrap. Normal sisal twine has a lubricant in it, as well as some rodenticides and things like that in it, that actually can cause a breakdown of the UV inhibitor of the plastic. It will leach through the plastic and break down the UV inhibitor of that plastic. I really like net wrap for this purpose because you don't get as much deformation of those bales, and certainly you also have more field efficiency compared to twine wrapped. Now it does make it harder to get that back off of there, especially if you live in an environment where those bales will freeze during the winter. Sometimes net wrap can be a little bit harder to get off of a frozen wrapped bale like that. So you also want to choose an appropriate site for wrapping. I recommend wrapping at the storage site. Wherever it is that you plan on feeding out of that area, that's where you should be wrapping it so that you don't have to handle it as much. This also reduces the risk of spoilage. Now this is a really nice little site that they've prepared here. It's a good dense sod, and they basically have gone in and sprayed out that sod. Okay, a little bit of green up that's coming back up, but that's primarily what they've done is they've gone in and sprayed the weeds out of there. And it's important to do this, get rid of those weeds, and make sure that you don't end up with any stobs. You know what a stob is? It's a cut off part of a big, thick, broadleaf weed that will poke through that plastic. All right, so don't have any of those around. Good, dense sod is the best place to have that. The other key there is to make sure you keep it clean and keep the vegetation under control around that, because that vegetation produces two things. It produces seed, and that's going to attract a lot of mice and rats, and the mice and rats are going to attract coyotes and all kinds of other things that will do damage to that plastic. So it's a good practice to avoid that if at all possible. Also, if you're going to put it out, by the way, don't put it right beside of a fence row. Leave enough room there in between the fence row that you can either mow it or keep that vegetation under control, because birds will light on that fence row, and then they'll come over and stand and poke and prod on that baleage as well. Now, this plastic is not impermeable to oxygen, so it's important that you apply enough plastic but not more than what you really need, because it is costly. The permeability of this plastic is approximately 10,000 cubic centimeters of oxygen per cubic meter in over a 24-hour period. Now, for reference, if you look at a silage bunker, a layer of that is probably going to be about 2,000. Okay, so multiple layers are going to be important here to exclude the oxygen there to make sure that you're getting. Now, there's some newer styles of stretch film that actually get that permeability down around 2,000 to 3,000, somewhat more similar to those silo covers. So for an application amount in an inline wrapper, I recommend at least 8 layers. Double at the joints if your wrapper has the programmability to put a double layer at the joints. That usually ends up being about 12.5 to 16.7% overlap. 2 rolls rotating around the bales in these inline wrappers makes for a fairly quick application there. And all this material is going to be stretched to 50 to 70%. The tacky side needs to be towards the bale so you get good adherence, and there are some now that have tacky on both sides of the wrap. This style you can get about 60 to 80 bales per hour up to that amount, but the individual wrapper by comparison is going to be much slower. Now in the individual, 6+ is what we would recommend. If we're going to be storing that for more than about 8 or 9 months, I really recommend going up to about 8 there even, especially in our environment with a lot of stress, the environment that places on that. That would give you about 50% overlap in a 2+2+2 system. It applies 2 wraps as you make a full rotation, both in the horizontal and vertical rotation. So it takes a little time to put all that plastic on. As a result, it's going to take you about an hour to do about 15 to 40 bales. Now here's some work from my master's research where we did a little cafeteria style experiment. We put out good quality alfalfa hay, hay that had been, or baleage that had been wrapped with 6 layers of plastic, 2 layers of plastic, and 4 layers of plastic. And you can see visually they know which one is the best. They've been able to determine that, and that was backed up by our results for the volatile fatty acids and so forth as well. At the end of the day, though, the consumption, though, this was over a 5-day period where we actually measured consumption. they ate 90% of the 6-layer plastic, and there was much more hay out there, much more forage out there than what they could consume in that particular time. And they will take to this pretty quickly. In fact, oftentimes there's some real challenges of even getting into the field to get this fed out. Feed it in an appropriate way. You definitely want to match the quality of the animals that need that quality. Just yesterday afternoon, I got a phone call from a producer who has some baleage that they made. That's 150 RFQ, and he's got dry beef cows. And, you know, that's way more nutrition than what a dry beef cow needs. So find a good outlet for that. Use a ring or cone feeder or some way of controlling the access to it. And especially with the newer style balers that actually slice that, you can use this in a TMR bale grinding system. I do recommend feeding those bales within a 9-month period if at all possible. That way that you avoid any, because this plastic does decompose or deteriorate over time, and it will allow oxygen to get in. Some of the newer plastics are much, much better than that, and especially if you put on extra layers, it's going to last at least 9 months. But the bales become, will squat, they deform, and they become very difficult to handle, and that plastic does deteriorate. The number 10 key and the last and final key is to have a plan for handling the plastic. One of the biggest frustrations that some of our producers have when they start feeding this is they say, I've got that plastic all over the farm, right? And so whenever you feed that, I think it's important to go ahead on that tractor, go ahead and just collect it, and then when you get back to the barn, put it into a barrel, put it into a box, put it into something so that you do that on a consistent basis. Now currently recycling is not an option in most areas. Now in some areas where they use a lot of ag plastics, like in South Georgia for example, we have some recycling outfits that will take that, but not very many. The key there I think is to reduce the bulk to aid in handling. Now when I was at the University of Kentucky, we had a bunch of old tobacco balers that were around. And so we made these tobacco balers. And some of you all remember Dr. Mike Collins, who was my major professor at the University of Kentucky. And he had a wild hair one day, and you know that's what graduate students are for. So he had us go out and bale up a bunch of that plastic and with square baler. And believe it or not, it actually worked quite well. And believe it or not, it actually cleaned out fairly well too. I would not necessarily recommend that, but that is one way to reduce the handling. There are a number of resources on the web. This is just some that I've had influence with or were party to with the UK publication. We use those for our events, but there are many others that are on the various locations on the web. In fact, part of this, Some Points on Feeding Baled Silage, was in an article for the Progressive Forage Grower magazine a month or so back. So with that, any questions, comments, or emotional outbursts? Chris?
I've seen a trend of producers using wrapping to kind of conserve hay that's below the ideal siling moisture, you know, so say between 20 and 40%.
Yeah.
And I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I don't know if there's been any research on that you know of.
I don't know of any research that's been done on that, and maybe Wayne or Kunjun will know, but I don't know of any that has actually looked at that from a research perspective, but I'll tell you that scares me a little bit for a variety of reasons. You know, it definitely could result in significant amount of mold development. Even in an anaerobic environment, the porosity of that material, even though there's plastic around it, there's still the porosity of that material is such that there's quite a bit of oxygen still in those bales, especially at that low dry matter, or you know, low moisture, I mean to say. So it's very concerning to me. I have a number of producers who are also making hay, and then they'll let it go through a sweat, and then they'll wrap it, and I'm okay with that as long as it's gone through a sweat. We also bale up a lot of crop residues. And that stuff is bone dry when it's baled up, and usually that's not too much of a problem. And they'll wrap that sometimes, and even then they'll get some condensation on the inside of the wrap. So I'm not a big fan of that. Although there's a number of producers that we have that swear by it, but I think it's a bit of a Russian roulette. Yes.
Will something like max
Yes, Max Q actually will do quite well. In fact, we did some baleage work with it and did a feeding trial with it back in the spring of this year. And well, we baled it in the spring and fed it in the fall again to some replacement heifers, and it worked quite well. It worked quite well. That would have been in the boot stage. Yeah. Now, if it's mature tall fescue, then it's going to be fairly low in soluble sugars and fermentable sugars, and not going to ferment well. Gary?
So, Dennis, have y'all had much experience with botulism?
Unfortunately, yes. In my career, and that's spanning back to my UK days, I've had 2 instances of botulism, both of which were situations where there was way excessive moisture. Okay, the first one was where the producer was baling it literally in the rain. Okay, it was a heavy downpour. It was on the wet side to begin with, and he was baling in the rain, and it was extremely wet. The other case was some ryegrass that they cut in the morning and then baled that afternoon. They had it backwards. They should have done it the other way, the afternoon of one day and then bale it the next day. And it ended up being very, very wet. I think it was like 75% moisture, and that's a recipe for disaster.
Have you seen it on the other end of the moisture range?
On the dry end,
Yeah.
I have not seen that, although that's a possibility if it doesn't ferment very well. That's a real possibility, I guess.
Do you know, do you have any experience on how to even diagnose that?
Whether or not it's botulism that's caused it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really confusing. I mean, I've got these phone calls and they'll say, yeah, the vet says it's botulism. They were feeding haylage, but, you know.
Yeah, there is a test that can be done to determine if the baleage has botulism in it, and that's the next step that I would take. I would have to ask the veterinarian as to, you know, what are some of the symptoms that or signs that show up in the animal with regard to botulism. I know some of the basics, but in terms of the metabolic response of that animal to it, I'm not sure of. I have an extension veterinarian that I depend on probably way too much for that. But Conjun, do you have something to add to that? Sure.